Hello everyone, how's it going? In this video we will take a look at functions in Kotlin. So we will see what is a function and how we can define a function and what kind of arguments it takes and how we can call a function. Alright, so functions are the building blocks of a complex program. So in programming, a function is a group of statements that can perform a specific task. So functions are used to break the code into smaller modules or smaller subprograms, which makes the program more manageable. So that's one of the advantages of the functions. So for example, if we have to compute the grade of a student, then we can define a function that performs this specific task. We can call this function any number of times and it will return us the grade of a student. So function avoids the repetition of code and makes the code more usable. In Kotlin, we have two types of functions, standard library function and we have user-defined functions. The standard library functions are built-in functions in Kotlin that are available for use. We can also call them the standard library functions or predefined functions. For example, we have worked with the println function. So we have worked with this println function. And what this function does is that it takes an argument and print whatever we pass it to the standard output stream. So the println function is not defined by us, it is defined by Kotlin developers. So if I call this function and pass a value like hello, and I'm going to open the definition. So here we can see that this is an inline function which takes in a message and it can be of any type. And then what it does is print the message to the standard output stream. The second type of functions are called user-defined functions. So these are the functions that we define and we call them in our program to perform a specific task. So for example, we can define a function that adds two numbers, and we can also define a function that checks whether the number is odd or even. And then later on we can call this function in our program. So that was a bit of introduction about functions and their different types. Now we are going to see how we can create a function and how we can use it in our program. To define a function in Kotlin, the fun keyword is used. So I'm going to type fun. Then comes the name of the function, which is the identifier. So I'm going to call my function my func, and then we have a set of parentheses and we will talk about what goes inside, but for now I will leave them empty. Then we have the body of the function, which we represent using the curly braces. The function will execute whatever is inside these curly braces. So this is basically the body of the function. Now we are going to define the job of this function or the specific task that it performs. So this function will print hello world to the output window. We know that to print something to the output window, we use the println function. So I'm going to call another function inside of my own function. So I'm going to write println and I'm going to pass it hello world. So this function will print whatever we pass to it to the output window. So we have defined our function and we have also defined the task that it performs. It prints hello world to the output window. But now the question is how we can call this function or how we can execute the body of this function or whatever code that is written inside these curly braces, how we can execute it. To execute the code inside the body of the function, we have to call the function. So how we can call a function? To call a function, we are going to type the function name. And then we have the set of parentheses which indicates that we are calling a function. So this statement that we have written inside the main function calls this function that we have defined below. Now we are going to run the program and we will see the output. So I'm going to click on this play icon and we will wait for the program to build. So here we can see our program is up and running, and we can see the output printed in the output window down below. So that's how we define and call a function. The program starts its execution from the main function, and when the control reaches line 3, the control is sent to line 6 where we have defined the function body. And then it executes this line of code. After execution of the function, the control is sent back from here to where the function is called from, which in this case is the main function. And since we have no more lines after this, our program terminates. Now we are going to see what are function parameters. Functions exchange information by means of parameters and arguments. The term parameter refers to any declaration within the parentheses, within these parentheses in case of this function, following the function name. So whatever goes inside these parentheses will be referred as the function parameter. And the term argument refers to any expression within the parentheses of a function call. So for example, we are calling this a println function here. Whatever we pass in here, this is referred to as the argument of a function. Now we are going to add parameters in this function that we have defined. Function parameters are defined using Pascal notation. So we type the name of the parameter, and then we have the type of the parameter. And the type can be a string, integer, or anything else. And these two are separated by this double dot or a colon. So I'm going to pass in the name parameter here. I'm going to call my parameter name, and this will be of type string. My func now takes a parameter of type string, and we can use this parameter inside of this function. So instead of printing hello world, I'm going to print whatever is passed to this function as an argument. So I'm going to print the value of name. And up here we have a red squiggly, as we can see, and let's see what IntelliJ says about it. So it's saying that no value is passed for the parameter name. So which means that we are calling a function, and we are calling a function which does not take any argument. And we have not defined such a function anywhere in this main.kt file. We have only one function which takes an argument, so we have to provide one. To provide a value for this parameter, I'm going to type a value here, and I'm going to pass in John. So let's run the program to see the output. So our program is up and running, and here we can see we have John printed in the output window. So that was the value that we passed as a function argument. So this value got received here, and then we have used this value and pass it to the println function. A function can have multiple parameters as well. So I'm going to define another function which performs the addition of two numbers. I'm going to call this function add, and this function will take two parameters. So I'm called the first one number1, num1, and this will be of type integer. And the two parameters are separated with a comma. And then I'm going to call the second parameter num2, and this will also be of type integer. Then we will define the function body. Inside the function's body, I'm going to call a println function, and I'm going to perform addition of these two numbers. So I'm going to pass in num1 plus num2. And I'm going to comment this function for now, since we're not going to call it. To call the add function, we have to type the function name followed by a set of parentheses. And we also have to provide the function arguments. So we have to provide values for num1 and num2. So I'm going to pass in 2 and 3. Let's go ahead and run this program to see the output. So our program is up and running, and here we can see we have 5 printed on the output window. So that is how we define a function with multiple parameters. Functions can also return a value. So imagine we want to perform some task inside the function and then we want a result back to where we call the function from. Like, for example, we want the result back inside the main function. That's where the return types come in handy. The return type is defined after the parentheses that contain the function parameters. To define a return type, we use a colon followed by the return type. So since this function add two numbers, it should return the sum, which will be an integer. So the return type would be an int. So we can see that we have a red squiggly, which means that we are not returning a value from this function. So I'm going to delete this line because instead of printing the sum here, I'm going to return the sum. So I'm going to return num1 plus num2. So suppose that we want to use the sum inside the main function, and we can achieve that by returning the sum from this function. So the function is returning the sum, and we are going to catch the value over here. So we're going to store this sum in a variable. So I'm going to define a variable and I'm going to call it sum, and this will be equal to the result of this add function. So the way this works is that when this function is called, the control moves to line 11, and after adding number 1 and number 2, the sum is returned, and this function call will be replaced by the sum, by whatever value this function actually returns here. And we have sum. So now let's go ahead and print the sum. So I'm going to call a println function, and I'm gonna pass in sum here. Now let's run our program to see the output. So our program is up and running, and here we can see we have a 5 printed down in the output window. So that's how we return a value from a function. So now the question is, what would be the return type of this function, since it is not returning anything? In other programming languages, for example Java, we have a void. So in Kotlin, if a function does not return anything, the return type is a unit. So this return type basically means that function is not returning anything. And one important thing to note is that it is optional to specify the return type in a function definition if the return type is unit. So if a function does not return anything, we can omit this. So I'm going to delete that. This will work fine as well.